So I went to get my game moving forward and on its way to an actual commercial release. In order to really get the ball rolling, I'm going to focus all my effort right now into getting a good enough project so that I can make a Steam page for it. It would probably have been a better idea to set up this page much earlier on in development, but I have a much better idea of what I want this game to be, and the game itself is in a much better state now, so I think it's getting to be a good time to make the Steam page. But I don't want to finish the page now and then have to completely redo it in a few months. So I want to finish up some enhancements for the game that I've been working on, specifically graphical ones, before I make the game page and the first trailer. First off, I want to finish the main menu and I want to finally fix the third person player by adding some inverse kinematic arms and improving the animations. I also want to finish adding a new player model and add player customization to the game. If I get all of these things completed, I will feel comfortable making the Steam page and also maybe releasing a new demo with all these new features added. The first week after the last devlog was mostly dedicated to making a game jam for Devlog's Ready Set Jam competition, which I will eventually make a video over. But I still got a bit done. The first thing I did was enable ambient occlusion, which is a graphical effect that makes shadows between objects and overall just gives a bit more of a solid feel to the outlines of objects. I messed with it later to make it look better, but I do think that it added to the overall look of the game and was a much needed effect. After that, I decided to try out adding an actual color palette to the game and using it for the material colors. Up until now, I've just been kind of randomly assigning the colors, just based on what I think looks nice. And while this has mostly worked, I want to try out using a color palette. So I found one online and applied it to the game. Things like the grass and dirt only changed a tiny amount, but it was a much more noticeable things for things like the arch and rocks. The arch is no longer straight red, but has more of a purple look to it, which I really like. And the rocks are also less white and have a bit more of a purple tint to them as well. After adding this color palette, I then messed with lighting and post-processing effects to try to fine-tune the color of the game. I think the final result is very similar to what I had before, but just slightly better. I also added bloom to the game, which I did not have before, but it made the explosions and gunfire look much better. It was a very simple upgrade that had a pretty noticeable effect. Overall, I think that I've found a pretty nice graphical style for the game. It is low poly and textureless, which is not completely original. There are plenty of other games out there that have used it. On the last video, I had a ton of comments that pointed out how my game looked similar to Totally Accurate Battlegrounds by Landfall Games. Most of these comments were perfectly fine and just pointing it out. Some were being a little bit extreme about it. I'll admit that I have been very inspired by Landfall Games in the process of making this game, mostly by Stickfight the Game, which was the basic inspiration for the core gameplay, and Totally Accurate Battle Simulator, which I drew inspiration from for the art style because I think it really does low poly art style better than most other games. But I didn't want my game to look like a ripoff, so I'm going to fix a part that I think seems a bit too derivative. The player model that I made last devlog looks practically like a tabs unit, especially the head and eyes, so I decided that I would redo it and come up with something a bit more original before animating it and putting it into the game, which I will do later. But before I do any of that, I need to actually get a functioning main menu, because the game is kind of unplayable without one. Last devlog I made the base for the menu, some models, and the start page section of the menu, so now I have to get player drop-in working. This will require me to figure out how to use the gamepad to select UI elements, which will definitely be a hassle, so I need to get started. Although I find a way to get the gamepads to move around in the menu, I realized that it would only support one button highlighted at a time, and I needed to allow up to 4 gamepads to be moving around and highlighting buttons at once for the menu I originally envisioned. And I would have to make my own UI setup for that instead of just using the default one in Unity, and I decided that really wasn't worth it, so I then realized I needed to do a bit of redesigning. I eventually came up with the idea to make it so that the player can cycle between the 2 options of the menus, which are the hats and player colors, by making the 2 axes of the D-pad on the controller cycle through them. I think this was pretty great, as it not only made it so I didn't have to use any complicated UI systems, which would waste quite a bit of time, but it was also pretty elegant and looked better than having a bunch of boxes. This new system would need a new UI setup to work, so I got to work redesigning the menu to fit. After getting the design in place, I began to set up the code to make it actually work. For now, I'm going to be skipping the customization options and just getting onto the state where you can actually drop in, ready up, and move to the next state of the menu. I'll come back to those customization options next devlog though. So I completed the drop-in menu, and now it actually works. After making it, I took a break to make some new models for the room of the main menu. The drop-in menu was finally completed, although customization was skipped over for the time being. The next screen was the game mode screen, which was much simpler. I simply had to add descriptions for the current game modes that I planned for the final game that come up whenever you hover over the buttons. The only one that is actually available in the current version will be arcade mode. The final step for this basic version of the menu was the final options screen. This is where you can change things like game mode options and also which stages you play on and which weapon spawns, which will also be able to change during the game in the pause menu. But these features are not implemented yet, so I just decided to finish up the menu by making the play button. This button required me to set up the score key, which is just an object that persists between scenes and keeps things like the options, scores, and other variables that I need to make the game work. I finished up making the play button, and now the menu is fully functionable. It is missing all customization and the final option menus, but it's good enough for now. After finishing up the menu, I decided to turn my focus to the player model. To say that redesigning this player model was a hassle would be a huge understatement. I must have made 12 different player models before I finally settled on one that I thought was passable. The final model had a more circular head, no eyes, gloved hands, and a slightly different body than the player I had in the last devlog. I think this differentiated enough from the tabs unit. After finalizing the model, I began to animate it. It actually had inverse kinematics in the legs, so making its running cycle was very simple. I based the sliding animation on one I saw in an Unreal Engine tutorial thumbnail that I saw on Google that I thought looked nice. And I think the sliding looks quite a bit better than the glorified sitting that I have in the game right now. The jumping is also pretty simple, and I think it works as well. I imported all these new animations into Unity and got them all working in-game. The transition between some of them are a little bit too slow, but I plan on fixing that in the future. And now I was going to make inverse kinematics, and I've tried inverse kinematics in the past, and it has never gone well. But I think I can do it much better this time because the arms are actually part of the player model now instead of just being a thing I stuck on them. This should simplify a lot of the code. I looked around online and found a simple inverse kinematics package made by Digital Games that I was actually able to get to work after a little bit of fiddling. It doesn't look perfect because it scales the arms a little bit weirdly, but that shouldn't be a huge deal once you get everything put together. I put IK scripts on the player's arm by default, and whenever you pick up a gun, it sets the targets for these inverse kinematic scripts to bones on the gun's arm rig. This makes it so that not only do the hands go to the correct places, but they also move with the reloading and shooting animations. I had to individually set this up for each gun, but I finally got it working. These inverse kinematic arms are a pretty big deal in my opinion. Now the third-person models for the players look much nicer, and I don't just have floating guns. This should make footage for the trailer for the Steam page look much nicer and more finished, and I'm fairly sure that it'll have a game page on Steam by the end of the next devlog. But the inverse kinematic arms are not quite complete, as I still need to have targets they automatically get set to whenever you don't have a gun in your hands. That way it just does running. The final thing I did for this week was just set up first-person guns to be rendered separately from the other things in the game. This was supposed to allow me to overlay them to stop them from clipping through walls and being affected by certain graphical effects. But overriding the render depth of the gun made it render strangely, with the back of the gun rendering over its front. If anybody knows how I can fix this, then that would be greatly appreciated. But moving it to a separate render object was still useful because now I can alter the field of view of the game without altering the field of view of the gun and making it look weird. So you can hopefully expect a FOV slider in the game sooner or later. Anyways, thanks for watching. There's a free demo of the game available for download on itch.io, so be sure to like and subscribe to follow the development of this game. Bye.